Hi there. In this video series, I'm going to break down the game Bloodborne unlike anybody else ever has. To be specific, I'm going to explain the real-life inspiration for the game, I'll explain the game's overarching meaning, and I'll explain how that primary source of inspiration shaped almost everything in the game, from its story to its characters, its settings, its items, its dialogue, and its mechanics. What I'll present to you in this series will be the single most comprehensive, evidence-based explanation of Bloodborne to date. I don't say that to be cocky, I say it because the evidence is just so overwhelming. I'll explain how the major characters and areas got their names and what they're supposed to symbolize. I'll explain the true meaning of the Old Blood, the Beastly Scourge, and the Healing Church. All of that will be revealed in good time. After the first 10 minutes or so, you're probably going to be a little skeptical of what I'm telling you, and that's completely understandable. It takes some time for us to establish a little history and start revealing the initial evidence. After about 20 minutes, you're going to be really intrigued and probably starting to buy in a little. And if you're willing to stay with me for this first video, we're going to be holding hands and running through the streets of Yharnam together. By the end of this series, you'll have a completely new outlook on the game. I'm that confident. It'll just take a little patience. I'll start with a short introduction, then we'll start getting our hands dirty. For nearly 7 years since its release, Bloodborne's Victorian gothic horror tale has completely mystified its most ardent fans, myself included. We've been struggling to answer the question, what's going on here? All too often, we lore hunters have fixated on a random hodgepodge of elements within Bloodborne, unable to form a coherent narrative or a metaphorical framework. We've interpreted everything far too literally. And we've also too often defaulted to the assumption that most of Bloodborne is completely inexplicable thanks to the eldritch nature of the game. To truly understand Bloodborne, we have to break out of these patterns. Anyone who's spent considerable time and effort examining the game's aesthetics, its dialogue, and its vast library of inventory items, attire, weapons, and consumables recognizes that Bloodborne wasn't influenced by just a single source. Its game designers, From Software, and director Hidetaka Miyazaki seem to have drawn upon myriad inspirations. But there actually is a main source of inspiration for the game and a related group of historical events, historical figures, and literary sources that were used to flesh out the game. And despite speculation that has persisted for years, Bloodborne is no more a Lovecraft game than it is a poetry game. Lovecraft really isn't the source of Bloodborne's magic. Bloodborne's themes of death, dreaming, madness, and consciousness understandably have opened the door for numerous interpretations of the game's reality. Is it all a dream? Is it a dream within a dream? Is this the afterlife? The answer, in short, is no. Beginning today, I want to lay out the single most comprehensive evidence-based explanation to date of Bloodborne's story, meaning, and allegorical skeleton onto which the game's flesh is attached. This isn't a theory or a guess or an idea. It won't be 100% exhaustive, though, and there will be many questions that I just can't answer. I also can't go item by item, line by line. There's just too much to cover. It's a massive game in terms of its lore. But this will be incredibly thorough. First, 2 housekeeping notes. Number 1, I am not Vati. This will not be a cinematic experience full of captivating audio and video clips. This is a presentation of evidence that's designed for the serious lore enthusiast. It'll be exceptionally eye-opening, but it's not going to be video candy. Number 2, you're going to hear me use the phrase meant to represent quite a bit. Much of what I'll go over are the real-life people, institutions, creative works, and historical events that Bloodborne's creators relied upon for inspiration. It's important to keep in mind that Bloodborne possesses both an in-game lore and an extra-game lore. We'll focus on both, but this series is designed to reveal a heretofore undiscovered story and meaning of the game that can only be understood by extrapolating the in-game lore and contextualizing it with extra-game sources. I'm confident that there will be many mind-blowing revelations for you in this video series, just as there were for me in the research and analysis process. All I ask of you in this dissection of Bloodborne is that you stay for the whole operation. As I mentioned in the introduction, the core mission of lore hunters has been to answer the question, what's going on here? Popular theories are that Bloodborne takes place within a dream, or within multiple layers of dreams, or that it takes place in an altered state of consciousness, like an illusion, hallucination, or some other form of neurological condition. While none of these is technically wrong, they lack a degree of specificity about the nature of this strange state of the game. In this section, we'll break down the main inspirations for the game, discuss how some of the most important characters and places got their names and designs, and we'll talk about what paleblood is really supposed to mean. As a courtesy warning, this section will contain the image of a dead body with surgical stitching. With all this in mind, let's cut to the chase and say what's happening. Bloodborne is a massive allegory. Its themes, settings, institutions, and characters are inspired by period-specific people, institutions, and events. As we can see from the most superficial elements of the game, Bloodborne takes place in a setting that mirrors 1800s Great Britain, mainly the latter half of the century. The architecture and the voice acting make this clear. The weapons and technology of the game make this clear. Importantly, we begin the game in a clinic, having undergone a medical treatment for a mysterious illness, and we fixate the entire game on trying to understand this mysterious healing substance used by a healing church that considers among its most revered locations a surgery altar and a research hall. From Software is giving us the clues here. They chose these features for a reason. They chose to start us here in a clinic for a reason. If you pay close attention to details large and small, it's impossible not to see the near omnipresence of medical imagery and language. That brings us to the game's main idea. Bloodborne is meant to depict the nightmarish experience of Victorian-era illness and disease and the dehumanizing nature of medical research, surgery, and addiction. Again, Bloodborne is meant to depict the nightmarish experience of Victorian-era illness and disease and the dehumanizing nature of medical research, surgery, and addiction. To do this, Bloodborne relies on the lives, creative works, philosophy, and scientific discoveries of the great thinkers and figures of the Victorian age. In this regard, Bloodborne is a child born of the 19th century's great ones. Its artists, scholars, authors, and leaders, specifically those whose lives and works were rooted in or closely associated with illness, disease, medical science, and medical practice of the era. The game employs the themes of death, dreaming, madness, and consciousness as thematic devices to both veil and convey the underlying message. As I mentioned in the introduction, Bloodborne is inspired by many sources, but there is no doubt in my mind that at its core, Bloodborne is an elegant, expertly hidden homage to the lives and creative works of two men in particular, Robert Louis Stevenson and William Ernest Henley. As strange as that may sound, there is a mountain of evidence to support this conclusion. Henley's life and poetry in particular serve as the foundation upon which everything is built. Stevenson's literary works, meanwhile, help to shape the game's characters and mythology in many critical ways. In order to understand the pyramid of Bloodborne's lore, we have to examine the bricks at the foundation that were laid by Henley. For this video's discussion, that's where we have to begin. I have to concede that this first video is by far the weakest of the entire series, both in terms of incontrovertible evidence and mind-blowing revelations, but it's essential to our understanding of the lore. I promise that your patience will be rewarded. Born in Gloucester, England in 1849, William Ernest Henley lived through the majority of the Victorian era, the period in which Bloodborne appears to be set. Most famous for his 1875 poem Invictus, Henley spent much of his career as a literary critic, editor, and writer, composing several books of poetry. As a child, Henley was diagnosed with tubercular arthritis, sometimes referred to as tuberculosis of the bones, which later forced the surgical removal of his left leg below the knee. Complications from the illness, mainly infections, required attention throughout his life, including a 2-year stay at the Royal Infirmary of Edinburgh, one of Scotland's leading hospitals, from 1873 to 1875. It was there that a bedridden Henley composed, among other works, a collection of poems called Hospital Sketches, which 3 decades later were combined into a book of poetry titled In Hospital. The collection featured 28 poems written from Henley's perspective as a patient. As a realist poet, Henley focused on the mundane details of hospital life. He beautifully and painfully captured the physical and emotional suffering of injury and illness while observing the sights and sounds of the dying. He spoke to the sensory experience of hospital existence, and without naming names, richly captured the idiosyncrasies of the men and women around him, both caretakers and patients. Most importantly for our understanding of Bloodborne, Henley portrayed the Royal Infirmary as a place of captivity, both because of his relative powerlessness and the hospital's cold, austere environment. We'll discuss these themes in much greater depth. In the longest and most gripping poem of the series, titled Operation, Henley details the dehumanizing surgical process that he experienced firsthand and the otherworldly sensation of contemporary anesthetics, which we'll see serve as the foundation for Bloodborne's healing blood and its beastly scourge. We'll come back to these topics in later videos of the series. Like the player character of Bloodborne, Henley traveled from afar to a specialized facility to seek a miracle treatment. In the opening cutscene of the game, the mysterious blood minister tells us, Yarnum is the home of blood ministration. In the late 1800s, Edinburgh became the world's leader in blood transfusions, and the Royal Infirmary in Edinburgh, where Henley spent 24 months, would eventually become the first medical facility in the world with a dedicated blood donation and transfusion service. This is no coincidence. In his poems from In Hospital, Henley wrote about his confidence-crushing arrival at the Royal Infirmary and the tense, uncomfortable scene of the waiting room, littered with, quote, scissors and lint and apothecary's jars, lint meaning gauze, and, quote, dressings on the long, lean table, not at all unlike the visual we experience when the game begins in Yosefka's clinic. Henley's arrival to the infirmary represented the start of a long, difficult journey of self-discovery, healing, and reclaiming his independence, just as our arrival and awakening within Yosefka's clinic represents the start of our long, difficult journey of discovery in the Bloodborne universe and our quest to transcend the hunt and break free from the dream. Before Henley traveled to Edinburgh, doctors in England had told him that there would be no way to save his other leg from amputation. But a determined Henley journeyed over 400 miles to Scotland in the hopes that a British surgeon, who was pioneering a new technique called antiseptic surgery, would be able to perform a miracle. The technique, antiseptic surgery, involved sanitizing surgical surfaces, tools, and surgical incisions in order to prevent infection. The surgeon who popularized the technique and who ultimately saved Henley's right leg was a man named Joseph Lister. In Bloodborne, we begin the game in the clinic of Yosefka, which is a feminized version of Yosef, the Russian name for Joseph. This is no coincidence. When the player character awakens at the beginning of the game, we're wearing the foreign attire set. It indicates that the player character, like Henley, has traveled from afar. We're also wearing a sullied bandage that is specifically described as unsanitary. These are some of the first clues to connect us, the player character, to William Ernest Henley, who came to Edinburgh, the home of blood transfusions, for an antiseptic or sanitary surgery performed by a man named Joseph. For months, I had focused on the medical theming of Bloodborne, trying to establish a clear through line to help me make sense of the game. In reality, the medical metaphor is an inseparable companion to Henley's story. Henley's poetry ultimately is what tipped me off to this connection. In the first 5 poems of In Hospital, Henley paints a picture of the Royal Infirmary in such a way that it might as well have birthed Yosefka's clinic right there on the page. He also repeatedly makes mention of anesthetics and analgesics of the time. My neighbor chokes in the clutch of chloral, he says, referring to chloral hydrate, a highly addictive sedative. The atmosphere suggests the trail of a ghostly druggist, he writes, implying the lingering, heavy scent of anesthesia. Henley's lengthy stay in the Royal Infirmary included the complicated surgery for its day that ultimately saved his other leg from amputation, although it required extensive recovery. Describing the anxious moments before his surgery, he anticipates, quote, the thick, sweet mystery of chloroform. Just like the blood minister tells us in the opening cutscene as we're administered the Yharnam blood. Yharnam is the home of blood ministration, he says. You need only unravel its mystery. As we begin to see, Bloodborne is mirroring the experience of William Ernest Henley and using it as the central frame or skeleton for the flesh of the game. As I'll explain in much greater depth later, every major organization within Bloodborne is meant to represent a part of the medical establishment of Edinburgh in and around the Victorian era, from the end of the 18th century to the late 19th century. The Healing Church represents the Royal Infirmary of Edinburgh under the new system of Joseph Lister, who was head of surgery in the 1870s. The School of Mensis represents the anatomists who made Edinburgh the world's capital of cadaver dissection in the early 1800s. The College of Bergenworth represents the University of Edinburgh's medical school at the Old College and its pharmacological research of the late 1700s. Canehurst, meanwhile, represents the opposition to Lister's method and the embrace of alternative anesthetics of the period. Everything is tied to Henley, either directly or indirectly, mainly via the city of Edinburgh and its status as the mecca of medicinal and surgical study of the Victorian age. The striking similarities between Henley's poems and Bloodborne become much more evident in the 5th installment of In Hospital, titled Operation, which I mentioned before. Here, Henley captures his feelings of fear and psychological trauma having undergone a modern surgical procedure while enduring the otherworldly effects of contemporary anesthesia. You are carried in a basket like a carcass from the shambles, to the theater, a cockpit where they stretch you on a table. Then they bid you close your eyelids and they mask you with a napkin, and the anesthetic reaches, hot and subtle, through your being. And you gasp and reel and shudder in a rushing, swaying rapture, while the voices at your elbow fade receding fainter farther. Lights about you shower and tumble, and your blood seems crystallizing, edged and vibrant, yet within you, racked and hurried back and forward. Then the lights grow fast and furious, and you hear a noise of waters, and you wrestle blind and dizzy in an agony of effort, till a sudden lull accepts you, and you sound in utter darkness, and awaken with a struggle on a hushed, attentive audience. Those well acquainted with Bloodborne's dialogue, item descriptions, and runes recognize that the verbiage we see in Operation appears in some of the most lore-intensive items in the game, such that we cannot help but see the impression that Henley's words made. We learn from the umbilical cord dropped by Murgo's wet nurse that it, quote, granted Mensis audience with Murgo, and that the great ice chalice allowed the choir to have audience with Abritus. Shudder is one of the most distinctive words to reappear in Bloodborne, as it comes on a mysterious and critical lore note in the Eden Chapel library. The Bergenworth spider hides all manner of rituals and keeps our lost master from us. A terrible shame, it makes my head shudder uncontrollably. The word rapture, of course, appears in the Blood Rapture rune, but much more importantly, it's in the chillingly bizarre dialogue of the imposter Yosefka, who is undergoing some sort of strange transformation or birthing process. Oh God, it feels awful, but it proves that I'm chosen. Don't you see how they writhe inside my head? It's rather rapturous. And of course, Henley's line, blood seems crystallizing, is a direct connection to the bloodstones, any variety of which states, after death, a substance in the blood hardens, and that which does not crystallize is called a bloodstone. Okay, you might be thinking, there are a few word similarities here. That doesn't prove anything. Fair, but there's so much more. Let's keep going. The influence of in hospital appears not surprisingly quite evident in the hospital-like research hall, specifically in the dialogue we receive from St. Adeline and other non-hostile patient characters. As we saw in the poem Operation, Henley notes the strange effect of anesthesia, writing, quote, "You hear a noise of waters." This is almost identical to the line we receive from a research hall patient who tells us, "Listen close and you too will hear the sound of water." Adeline offers one of the more memorable lines in the game when she receives a second dose of brain fluid, saying, "Oh, hello, do you hear that? The sticky sound, as clear as day. Slip, slop, drip, drop, slip, slop. How extraordinary." An enlarged head NPC similarly says, "Plip, plop, plip, plop, and splish, splash, splish, splash." This undoubtedly is a reference to Henley's poem titled Nocturne, in which he describes the sound of a leaking cistern or water tank that's keeping him awake through the night in the hospital. I must listen, listen, listen in a passion of attention till it taps upon my heartstrings and my very life goes dripping, dropping, dripping, drip, drip, dropping in the drip drop of the cistern. I focus on these poems and the broader work of In Hospital because they pertain to the surgical and anesthetic metaphors that, as we'll see, undergird the game of Bloodborne. But for the sake of understanding how these medical themes connect with the other overarching themes of recovery and regaining control of oneself, we can never lose sight of Henley's final line of the opening poem of In Hospital, titled Enter Patient. Describing the Royal Infirmary, Henley writes, "These corridors and stairs of stone and iron, cold, naked, clean, half workhouse and half jail." We'll return to this line many times, but for now, if you're still skeptical about this connection between Bloodborne and Henley, let's put that to rest. First, we'll clarify the meaning of paleblood, then we'll break down the single most compelling connection between Henley and what is arguably Bloodborne's main character. So let's clear up what's most likely the greatest mystery of Bloodborne. It's part of the first words uttered in the game, even before we take control of the player. Oh yes, paleblood. This term has confounded Bloodborne's players and lore hunters for years. Even game director Hidetaka Miyazaki acknowledged that the phrase was so vague that players generally failed to make any connection between the term pale blood and any other aspects of the game. While we have since understood that pale blood within the game refers to the final boss, the Moon Presence, that's not how we should view it for the sake of this part of the discussion. Instead, we have to view it through the life of William Ernest Henley and the medical metaphor. In his aptly named 2015 Drained of Blood interview with Future Press, Miyazaki said there are two ways to interpret the term pale blood. The first, he says, is the night sky of Yahar Ghul after the player kills Rom the vacuous spider. The sky there is a very pale blue, Miyazaki said, like a body drained of blood. Step back for a second. Don't think about the hanging men we find in the game. Just keep it simple. What is a body drained of blood? It's not complicated. A body drained of blood is an opened cadaver. It's no coincidence that we find the lore note about the pale blood sky in Yahar'gul, the realm overseen by the School of Mensis, which, as we'll see, is an organization meant to represent the anatomists of Edinburgh, those who dissected bodies for medical research. Pale blood, in Miyazaki's veiled explanation, is meant to have us associate Yahar'gul with bodies drained of blood, thus cadavers. One of the most common methods of dissection involves a Y-shaped incision on the chest and abdomen, followed by a vertical incision along the sternum to the neck. This is also the approach often used in autopsies. During the dissection process, blood drains out of the body by simple gravitational force. This Y-shaped incision, followed by a slice to the neck, is what the Hunter rune is really meant to depict. Because the rune is inverted and we see so many bodies hung upside down in the game, we focus on this dangling orientation and symbolism. But the symbol itself matches the incision pattern on a dissected corpse. If we rotate the rune, it's easier to see here. From the blood-starved beast to the snail women of the fishing hamlet, with their flesh of their backs flayed like a cadaver, dissected bodies are a huge part of the lore, as we'll discuss in much greater depth. Even Lawrence the First Vicar, in his cleric beast form, also is meant to represent a dissected body, which we'll discuss in a later video. You might scoff at that now, but you'll see what I mean. The title for this section is A Carcass from the Shambles, a line that Henley included in his poem Operation. A shambles is an old term for a butcher shop or slaughterhouse. Henley is describing his own body being carried to the operating table as a carcass or cadaver, straight from the slaughterhouse. I'm convinced that this is one reason why cadavers play such a prominent role in the game, but there are many others. While this helps us understand one sense of the term pale blood, Miyazaki refused to reveal the second meaning. With the medical metaphor on our side, though, we have the information we need to figure it out. As just discussed, William Ernest Henley suffered from tuberculosis of the bones. It's what forced the removal of his left leg earlier in life, and then prompted his journey to Edinburgh to seek experimental surgery to save his other leg. While the name tuberculosis is well understood today to refer to the disease caused by Mycobacterium tuberculosis, in Henley's day, the disease was known more commonly as consumption, or by a variety of nicknames, including the Great White Plague. The disease consumed its victims, resulting in decreased appetite and significant weight loss. Sufferers literally wasted away as if they were being consumed. But the disease got its name, the Great White Plague, because it caused a dramatic paling of the skin. Thanks to their gaunt appearance and ghostly pale flesh, tuberculosis victims looked like the undead. They had the appearance of a body drained of blood. They were like living cadavers. Sufferers of pulmonary tuberculosis also were plagued by a persistent cough that produced white phlegm and blood. When produced concurrently, the sputum would resemble pale blood. That's what we're supposed to associate with the term pale blood. It's understandable why the disease is to some extent an anchor point of the game Bloodborne. Consumption touched every life in Europe and America in the 1800s, whether you had the disease or not. By the end of the 19th century, tuberculosis had claimed the lives of nearly 1 of every 7 people who had ever lived. 1 of every 4 adults in Europe died from the disease. It was that widespread and that deadly. If you didn't have it, you lived in fear of the disease or had to care for ill loved ones that consumption had already touched. Within the densely packed cities of 1800s England and Scotland, tuberculosis could spread like wildfire. Oddly enough, tuberculosis, specifically the pulmonary variety, isn't a blood-borne disease. It's transmitted through the air, primarily through coughing, which is its main symptom. When we, the player character, arrive at the clinic in the early game, the blood minister's first words are, "Oh yes, pale blood," as if he's responding to something we told him. We did. In so many words, we told him that we, just like William Ernest Henley arriving in Edinburgh, are suffering from tuberculosis. We have the pale blood sickness. It's why the huntsman of Yarnham shouted us, "Away, away, you plague-ridden rat, and you're not wanted here." They see us as a diseased outsider responsible for their plague. It's why in the game's cut dialogue, the doll repeatedly refers to the player character as Mr. or Ms. Diseased in Japanese. The player character, to a large extent, is meant to represent a patient undergoing surgery within a dreamlike state brought on by the anesthesia-like blood that were administered in the game's opening cutscene. In many ways, we're following in the footsteps of William Ernest Henley, and many of our experiences within the game, from the people and enemies we encounter, the places we discover, and the nightmares we have to overcome, are inspired by Henley's experiences in real life. We'll go through these in the coming sections of the series. With pale blood somewhat clarified, let's shift over to the other piece of evidence that I mentioned earlier, the key character connecting Henley to Bloodborne. While in the Royal Infirmary in Edinburgh in 1875, Henley received a visit from his friend Leslie Stephen, a celebrated literary critic who was in Edinburgh at the time to deliver a guest lecture. Stephen brought with him to the infirmary an acquaintance, a young would-be attorney named Robert Louis Stevenson. Stevenson, who was born and educated in Edinburgh, had only recently completed his law studies. Despite already changing his career path once before, Stevenson was on the brink of abandoning law to dedicate himself to his true passions of travel and writing. Stevenson was just a year younger than Henley, having been born in 1850, and in addition to their closeness in age, the two shared a love of literature and storytelling. They also connected over their shared ailment. From an early age, Stevenson suffered from a debilitating lung condition believed to be either pulmonary tuberculosis or bronchiectasis. In little time, Henley and Stevenson formed a firm friendship. So firm, in fact, that just 8 years later, Stevenson would base his renowned character Long John Silver, the archetypal pirate figure in his famous novel Treasure Island, on his friend William Ernest Henley. Stevenson would tragically die of a brain hemorrhage at age 44, a result of his pulmonary illness that hounded him his entire life. But in his less than 20 years as an active writer, he demonstrated unimaginable productivity, creativity, and versatility. We'll see later how one of Stevenson's major works served as the basis for Bloodborne's primary feature, the healing blood. His fingerprints, just like Henley's, are found throughout the game, including on its hunters. While the French film Brotherhood of the Wolf is often credited as the inspiration for Bloodborne's hunter attire, which it probably is to some extent, its true origin is likely the statue in Edinburgh honoring Stevenson's 1886 novel, Kidnapped. As you probably have already recognized, William Ernest Henley and the first hunter Gehrman, our hunter guide for the game, are both missing a lower leg. So too is Long John Silver, the pirate character that Stevenson modeled upon Henley. It's no surprise then that Gehrman mirrors Long John Silver in many critical ways. While both characters have a peg leg, Long John Silver, for much of Treasure Island, appears as a sort of pirate mentor or guide to the protagonist Jim Hawkins, who has left his home in Bristol to hunt for treasure. This is exceptionally similar to Gehrman, the hunter's helper, who guides us, the player character protagonist of Bloodborne, who has left our home to go to Yharnam and embark upon a quest to hunt beasts. In Treasure Island, when it's later revealed that Long John Silver, the mentor to Hawkins, was in fact a mutinous cur who betrayed Captain Flint, Hawkins, the first-person narrator, must confront and fight Silver, just as we, the first-person player character of Bloodborne, must confront and fight Gehrman. These uncanny similarities suggest as though Gehrman, like Long John Silver, was at one point supposed to be more clearly revealed as a traitorous figure to the player character, or to the older figures in the game, possibly the College of Byrgonwerth. Of the material in the commercially released version of Bloodborne, Alfred's dialogue suggests Gehrman might have been just such a turncoat, but we can't say for certain. Alfred tells us, once a scholar betrayed his fellows at Byrgonwerth and brought forbidden blood back with him to Cainhurst Castle. We're left to guess whether this scholar was Gehrman. Cut dialogue, however, confirms that in earlier drafts of the game, Gehrman indeed was supposed to be a traitor. In the cut piece of dialogue, Master Willem tells Lawrence,
"You think now as Gehrman did to betray me."
Based on this information, we can confidently say that Gehrman was supposed to be much more explicitly depicted as a Long John Silver figure, a man without a leg who mentors a hunting protege, only to be revealed later as a traitor. In mirroring Long John Silver, who Robert Louis Stevenson based on William Ernest Henley, Gehrman also represents a caricatured, hospital-bound version of Henley, confined to a wheelchair, isolated, and despondent. Whereas Henley was trapped in the Royal Infirmary Hospital, which he described as half workhouse and half jail, Gehrman is trapped in the hunter's dream, begging for someone to unshackle him. Gehrman represents both Long John Silver in a literary sense and William Ernest Henley in a more literal sense. But that's not all. At the end of the game, Gehrman waits for us at the base of the great tree in the hunter's dream. He appears as he has for the entirety of the game, seated in his wheelchair, passive, tired, defeated. He slowly speaks to us, explaining that it's our time to die. If we choose to reject death at Gehrman's hands, the old hunter seems nonplussed. That's when we witness one of the more unusual features of the game, in my opinion. Gehrman, the wheelchair-bound, mild-mannered old man, transforms almost instantly into a sinister, violent figure. He stands tall and authoritatively. We see his rumpled cap replaced with a crisply shaped top hat, his faded clothes somehow replaced with a black and red cape, a flyaway collar, and a long overcoat. In essence, we're watching Gehrman as the mild-mannered Dr. Jekyll become the sinister, top-hat-wearing Mr. Hyde. This is no coincidence. The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is a Victorian Gothic horror written by none other than Robert Louis Stevenson. At the end of The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Jekyll is unable to recreate his serum, a special chemical cocktail that reverses his transformation. Although he ultimately kills himself as a last resort, Jekyll first locks himself away in his laboratory, a chemist's workshop, sparing the world from the nightmarish persona that he can no longer suppress, hoping that he can somehow find a cure. This is eerily similar to Gehrman, who willingly assumed his place in the hunter's dream, a recreation of the workshop that he founded, waiting for his compatriots, Lawrence and Willem, to find some sort of cure for the plague-gripping Yharnam that transformed men into beasts. Gehrman is a character embodying the most memorable creations of Robert Louis Stevenson, including one directly inspired by William Ernest Henley. As we see here and will continue to see again and again, the lives and works of Henley and Stevenson are the soul of Bloodborne. Hopefully I've gotten your attention in this first video. We've just begun to scratch the surface. In the next video, I'll explain what the healing blood is supposed to represent. Once we reveal its true nature, we can finally cut to the bone of the game's lore. I hope you'll check it out.